Welcome to NovaraLIVE. Coming up tonight, US President Donald Trump has announced a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, but will it last? Thousands of tenants will be taking to the streets on Saturday. The UK government is preparing worst-case emergency plans as the economic impacts of US's illegal war in Iran intensify, and young women are the most progressive demographic in the UK, but also the most disillusioned. And last of all, an EU Foreign Affairs spokesperson has a pretty wonky view of world affairs. I'm Helena, otherwise known by my internet moniker, known just as MTG. And it's Ladies' Night, it's Thursday, joined by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. I've been watching an ungodly amount of Iranian Lego AI propaganda. So let's see how that shapes the way I come to this show today, because I have to say, I do feel like my brain has sort of been rewired by it a little bit. I mean, it's so addictive.
Yeah, given the attitude of the Americans, it seems like fighting fire with fire when it comes to AI memes is probably the only language that Hegseth and Trump can understand. Now, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments down below. US President Donald Trump has announced a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, posting this on Truth Social this evening. I just had an excellent conversations with the highly respected President Joseph Aoun of Lebanon and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel. These two leaders have agreed that in order to achieve peace between their countries, they will formally begin a 10-day ceasefire at 5 p.m. EST. On Tuesday, the two countries met for the first time in 34 years here in Washington, D.C., with our great Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. I have directed Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Rubio, together with the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Raisin Kane, to work with Israel and Lebanon to achieve a lasting peace. It has been my honor to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th. So let's get it done, President Donald J. Trump. So all the people who don't like the impression, you're welcome. 5 p.m. Eastern Time is 10 p.m. in the UK. The news has come just hours after it was revealed that the US and Iran are negotiating to extend the temporary ceasefire, which is due to expire next week. Those talks, though, are off the book, and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt seemed keen to suppress any chatter on the subject last night.
I saw some reporting, again, bad reporting this morning, that we had formally requested an extension of the ceasefire. That is not true at this moment. We've remained very much engaged in these negotiations, in these talks. You heard from the Vice President directly and the President this week that these conversations are productive and ongoing, and that's where we are right now. I've also seen some reporting about the potentiality for in-person discussions again. Those discussions are being had, but nothing is official until you hear it from us here at the White House. But we feel good about the prospects of a deal. The president mentioned that in his interview yesterday, and it's obviously in the best interest of Iran to meet the president's demands. I think he's made his red lines in these negotiations very clear to the other side, and so we are continuing to see how these conversations go.
An end to Israel's war on Lebanon has been a key requirement in Iran's negotiations with the United States. Initially, there was confusion, and possibly even deception, over whether Lebanon was included in the terms of the Iran ceasefire negotiations. Iran said that it had to be, and Israel says that it wasn't, and the US said the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But on Tuesday, representatives from Lebanon and Israel met in Washington for the first direct talks between the two countries in 33 years. The timing of those talks, as well as informal US-Iranian talks over the ceasefire extension occurring immediately after, is suggestive, as is the question of whether this new ceasefire has any chance of holding. The signatories are Lebanon and Israel, but Lebanon is not a party to the war. Hezbollah is, and Hezbollah has not been involved in the negotiations. Indeed, Hezbollah vigorously protested the Lebanese government even agreeing to meet with Israel. So what's the background? Following Israel's joint attack on Iran with the United States at the end of February, Hezbollah resumed rocket strikes on Israel. Israel responded with airstrikes across Lebanon, including in the south and Beirut, while Israeli troops moved into Lebanese territory weeks later. Over 2,000 Lebanese people have now been killed in Israeli strikes, with more than 7,000 injured and 1.2 million people displaced across the country. Over 350 people were killed on a single day last week, when, following the announcement of the ceasefire between the US and Iran, Israel targeted densely populated areas of Beirut and other parts of Lebanon with hundreds of airstrikes that took place over the span of just 10 minutes. And even while diplomats from Israel and Lebanon met in Washington earlier this week, the Israeli strikes did not stop. Just a day after those talks, Israel killed 4 Lebanese paramedics in a triple-tap strike in the southern Lebanon town of Mayfadoun. According to the Lebanese Health Ministry, a first ambulance crew responded to an emergency call at the site of an Israeli airstrike. When they arrived, their vehicles were struck by an Israeli drone, killing 2 paramedics. A second unit then responded to rescue the survivors of the first unit, only for a drone to strike their vehicles as well, wounding 3 of those paramedics. A third team was then dispatched to treat all of those now injured in the 2 strikes, but they were hit in a strike too, with 2 more paramedics killed and further rescuers injured. One of those kills was 43-year-old paramedic Fadil Serhan, just weeks before a BBC journalist embedded with his team in the nearby city of Nabatieh.
The war has taken the life out of this place. Once vibrant, Nabatieh is now abandoned. Suddenly, they find a pickup truck, still burning, after being hit by an Israeli airstrike. And a body, unrecognizable, completely charred. Even these men, so used to death, for a moment are shocked. In an empty village, we meet a family, hunkered down. The war has forced 1 in 5 in this country to flee their homes, but some have decided to stay.
وهيدي بالنهاية أرضنا ما فينا نتخلى عنها بالسهولة للعدو وهيك ما عادش نرجع نجي نقعد هون. هيدا الشيء كتير بيأثر فيي. لو سمحت.
In wars, defiance can quickly turn into despair.
So this is the only strike in this area, only out.
Ali takes us to what is left of the paramedic station, destroyed by an Israeli airstrike.
So I'll show you here.
A colleague was killed.
He was here.
Yes.
He was talking to the phone with his wife actually, and it happened while he was talking on the phone.
Oh.
So he just disappeared suddenly. Unfortunately, we found him dead.
I'm sorry. And Israel says some ambulances and some health facilities are being used by Hezbollah.
This is a false claim. This is not true. They're trying to hide what they did by saying this. This is the only explanation.
Mm-hmm. They've been saying this repeatedly.
They don't have any evidence.
And you haven't seen anything?
If they have any evidence, let them show us.
The bombing in Nabatieh has continued today. Nada Homsi is a reporter with UAE paper The National News. She sent this report from Nabatieh today.
We're in Nabatieh right now. There was a huge series of air raids, what they call a fire belt, the effects of which are in the background, but they were very massive, to the point where right now we're at the meeting point where all the civil defense and ambulance services usually meet, to the point where everyone went rushing into the hospital because the strikes were so close. Right now, what's happening is that the civil defense and different paramedic services are basically trying to assess the situation and see if it's safe enough for them to go. They want to do something called a kashif, however that translates into English. Basically, they want to go and look around and see if there are people who are injured or if there are people who were killed so that they can pull them out of the rubble. But it's currently too dangerous, so they have to give it some time before the first wave of ambulances goes, and then if there is injured people and so on, they can commence with the operations. But I have to add, given the extent of the strikes that we heard and saw, in my personal opinion, I think it's very unlikely that there are survivors from this.
It's in that massively destructive context that US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social Wednesday night. Trying to get a little breathing room between Israel and Lebanon. It's been a long time since the 2 leaders have spoken, like 34 years. It will happen tomorrow. Nice, President G80. That post created more than a little confusion, especially since Israel's Security Cabinet met on Wednesday night without agreeing to a ceasefire, with other sources telling the Israeli press there was no plan for one to come into effect. But Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Khalibaf today reported a conversation that he had had with the Lebanese officials in which he stressed the importance of a Lebanon ceasefire in Tehran's negotiations with the United States, saying this: "We have been striving to compel our enemies to establish a permanent ceasefire in all the conflict zones. For us, a ceasefire in Lebanon is just as important as a ceasefire in Iran. we have been striving to compel our enemies to establish a permanent ceasefire in all the conflict zones. The question of a ceasefire in Lebanon is going to be a tricky one. The Lebanese government, led by Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, has prioritized disarming the military wing of Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Israel has occupied Lebanese territory in the south and has pledged to keep control of it until after the war ends. To that end, Israel's military is today reported to have destroyed the last remaining bridge across the Litani River, meaning the south of the country is now alleged to be entirely cut off from the rest of the country. The prospect of a prolonged occupation of Lebanese territory is likely to be unacceptable to many in Lebanon, even if the possibility of peace is appealing. There are also questions of trust and accountability. A lot of people have been killed, injured, and of course displaced, with many thousands of lives ruined. The mother and uncle of brothers Ali and Wael Sabah was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Nabatea last week. But the Israeli occupation of the region has meant they haven't been able to bury them. They spoke to Reuters a day after the Lebanese-Israeli talks in Washington.
My mother was found in the house. She was, I guess, next to that brown closet. As well, she was unscratched, unharmed, which is, I think, okay. And yeah, now we're going through the trouble of figuring out how to bury them.
We actually couldn't identify the building. We couldn't know because, as you can tell, it's half gone. And we spoke to our mother about less than an hour before, where the other bombing took place. And she said, no, everything's okay, and she was smiling and everything was okay. And then when people started sending screenshots, etc., we realized it's the one.
We come from the south of Lebanon, from Nabatea, and that is being bombarded on a daily basis. And we want them to be buried in the family cemetery, but unfortunately we're unable to do that. So we're now having to bury them in a temporary burial site until the situation becomes safe enough for us to take them to the south. Nobody should have to go through this. And unfortunately, my brother, sister, and I are not the only ones that are going through this. Hundreds, if not thousands on that day of families are mourning in the same way that I am. Not understanding what happened. And if they tell you there is a target here or a target there, come on. I mean, I don't know how to express this. From one end, I want people to heal, to be able to lead a normal life, but not without accountability. Definitely not without accountability. And all these peace negotiations, I think also, we're always going to be under the foot of the Israelis. Until there is a legal system that holds criminals to account, all of this is futile. None of it makes sense. And no, of course, I'm not for a peace agreement under the current circumstances.
It's in that context of historic pain, historic occupation, and historic political and military complexities, as well as extremely fragile moves towards peace, that US War Secretary Pete Hegseth made another intervention today.
We'll start with a message to Iran's military leadership, to the KH leadership and IRGC leadership. We're watching you. Our capabilities are not the same, our military and yours. Remember, this is not a fair fight. And we know what military assets you are moving and where you are moving them to. While you are digging out, which is exactly what you're doing, digging out of bombed out and devastated facilities, we are only getting stronger. You are digging out your remaining launchers and missiles with no ability to replace them. You have no defense industry, no ability to replenish your offensive or defensive capabilities. You only have what you have. You know that, and we know that.
Does seem like a lot of bluster there from P. Hegseth, Dalia, doesn't it? But on the subject of the actual, the preliminary information that we have on the ceasefire that's been announced in Lebanon between Israel and potentially Hezbollah, obviously we don't know what their reaction is going to be. Do you think this will last, or do you think that it'll be difficult to rein in Netanyahu?
The ceasefire will not last because the ceasefire is not designed to last. It is not a sincere attempt to secure a lasting peace settlement. And we're going to keep going through this cycle of announcing a ceasefire and then there's a flare-up, and then there's announcing a ceasefire and then there's a flare-up, because one of the sides in these negotiations, there's only one version of a settlement that is acceptable to them, and it is a version of the settlement that is not acceptable to anyone else in the region. And that is Israel's project of Greater Israel, which is not just about seizing the territory of Palestine. Obviously, territorial expansion is part of it, but much broader than that, it's really about engineering a new balance of political power in the region, or at least a decisive balance of political power in the region. Greater Israel, above all, is a desire for Israel to be the sole and single and decisive power broker in a region that is very resource rich and which is very important to the global economy, which therefore means that they will be a key global player. And in order to achieve the political aspirations of a Greater Israel, you have to be surrounded by states that are either failing states, very weak states, or states that are in a relationship of dependency to you. So a state that relies on you financially, that relies on you politically. And that is exactly what Israel is trying to engineer in Lebanon, including through this so-called ceasefire. They are trying to engineer a failed state in Lebanon, and I would argue at some point for this to devolve again into another civil war, of which Lebanon is not a stranger to, unfortunately. And so when you look at, firstly, because the first reason why this ceasefire is not going to work is because it is not actually, even though these talks were very historic in a sense, it's the first direct talks between the Lebanese government and the Israeli state in 30 years, I believe. But the direct talks are not between the two states, the two entities that are in conflict here. The entities that are in conflict here are primarily Hezbollah and Israel. Now, Hezbollah, of course, were not part of these discussions, and I do not think that they will take these discussions, the ceasefire, very happily. What it is it's about the stated aim of the ceasefire, which seems very reasonable from Israel's point of view if you ignore the past sort of 50 years of history. There's a non-state actor in the region. It is, uses violence as one of its methods, and we want that extra state actor to disarm. Now, if you were born yesterday, that sounds somewhat reasonable. Now, obviously, the entity that they're negotiating with, which is the Lebanese government, does not have the ability to disarm Hezbollah. Only Hezbollah has the choice to disarm itself, and Hezbollah will not make that choice so long as we continue to exist in a situation where, as the man in that video said, the Lebanon is living under the thumb of Israel. We are talking about a context in which Lebanon has been invaded by Israel, 7 or 8 times. It was under the south of Lebanon was under a military occupation by Israel for 18 years, And now it looks like southern Lebanon is going back under military occupation. And so within that context, you will only strengthen the movements whose stated aim is to resist that occupation, because occupation is not peace. Occupation is occupation. And so the Israeli calculation here is, let's create a setup where basically it is inevitable that the Lebanese state will not be able to uphold their side of the bargain because they are not able to disarm Hezbollah. And so, again, we will enter into, first of all, a deeper and more entrenched conflict between Hezbollah and the Lebanese government, and which could lead to civil war, and further justification for further violence and further occupation by Israel. And so that is why we will not see peace, like genuine and lasting peace, emerge from this ceasefire, because that is not what the ceasefire is designed to do. The ceasefire is designed to create future contexts and justifications for further Israeli invasion and aggression against Lebanon. And, Israel is playing a very urgent and zero-sum game at the moment, because I think Israel understand that this is very much a make or break moment in its history. Never again will it probably have as, a US president as addicted to chaos as it is, as willing to go along with its delusions of grandeur as the Trump administration is. We are seeing an emergence of a multipolar world, growing power of China, growing power of Russia. It will never be able to pull off these kinds of significant strides in weakening the region and becoming the main political broker in the region again. So it is viewing this moment, and this is why it has such a zero-sum extreme approach, is because as far as I think Bibi Netanyahu is concerned, both within his own political career and within the future of Israel, this is the golden moment where they can finally achieve the political and territorial goals of Greater Israel. I think they are aware that it is unlikely they will get an opportunity like this again, not least because of the emergence of a multipolar world, and also because public support for Israel across the West, which is, Israel after Israelis is Israel's main sort of audience, is falling very, very quickly.
I think that you made a really kind of cogent point there, especially that it is the compliance of the American government to the interests of Israel that gives it the green light to do what it does, to be able to have the endless amounts of benefit of the doubt, shall we call it, to be able to continue to do what it wants in the region is because of the compliant nature of Donald Trump specifically. Obviously, he entered into the war in Iran and then, of course, which exploded the conflict in Lebanon as a result, essentially because he was shown information by Netanyahu and did thumbs up, sounds good. That was essentially the position that they were in. America has the kill switch. If they want to end what Israel is doing in Lebanon, they just cut off the taps. Yeah. They can, just like they could have done at any point in Gaza, both Biden and Trump, they could have just cut off the access to military hardware at any point, and that would have forced Israel to back down. And they haven't done. And so it really is important from that perspective to understand that America could, if they really wanted to solve this conflict, if they really wanted to ensure that whatever's happening with the price of oil, what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz could be solved, to get to a position where every party in this conflict is adhering to the ceasefire protocols, they could tell Israel to stop, and they are not.
And I mean, look, this is obviously not to let previous US administrations off the hook. Like every other US administration in recent history has given Israel whatever it wants, short of going to direct war with Iran. That was the one thing that the Americans held back on this whole time. And they have finally found a president that was reckless and stupid and gullible enough to back them in attacking Iran. That's probably not going to happen again. I mean, who knows? Like, it's very difficult to predict things geopolitically now. But that is a very, very core, and especially now that we have seen the fallout and now that Iran has demonstrated that it actually has a strategy to go up against the most powerful military that has ever existed. Future US presidents are not going to do that again because they can see that actually it's not as simple as Trump thought, which is you go in, you bomb the shit out of people and you declare victory in 2 weeks. Actually, Iran does have leverage and it does have the ability to grind the world economy to a halt. So for Israel, like the idea of doing a ceasefire now, why would Israel put the brakes on their project of the Greater Israel now when the conditions that lay before them are more permissible than any conditions that have existed before them? It is make or break, and they will fight until the death for it. And it's not me, and I'm not conjuring this up out of nowhere. This is what the Israeli state are saying to their people. They might not be telling the West, we want a great, although they pretty much are, but not being very explicit about what their plans are for becoming the unquestioned power in the region and to be surrounded by weakened, failed Arab states. That's what they are telling their people. That is what we know from the way that the conversation within Israel, that's what the conversation within Israel is. And so the idea that Israel would somehow retreat or make some kind of a concession now at this point without being forced to by the Americans is completely delusional.
Yeah, 100%. Because again, like we talked about all the times that Israel has invaded Lebanon, the most famous time, of course, is in the 80s. And it was literally the American president who called up the Prime Minister of Israel and said, this is not a war, this is a Holocaust, and forced them to stop. And again, US could do that with Israel at any point, and they could have done it at any point in Gaza, and they haven't yet, up until basically it seems like this point. On Saturday, there will be a mass demonstration of tenants from across the country taking place on the streets of London. Backed by major trade unions and the Green Party, more than 80 organisations are uniting to back the National Housing Demo, making it the largest protest for affordable housing in over a decade. Thousands of tenants are expected to turn out, demanding the government take action to tackle rising rents and the severe shortages of social housing. Earlier today, I spoke with Joe Beswick from the London Renters Union, and I began by asking him what the movement's main demands are.
At the London Renters Union, and with about 80 organisations, we're all backing this huge national housing demonstration, which is taking place on Saturday in central London, Soho Square. And the thing that's exciting about the demo, and the reason that I'm really hyped for it, is that for the first time in a good while, the housing movement is uniting. So we've got private renters, social tenants, people living in temporary accommodation, and groups representing all of them, but also groups campaigning for disabled justice and so many others coming together to demand two things. So we're demanding rent controls and we're demanding more social housing, because the housing system in this country is extremely broken. And in the London Renters Union, we see the effects of that every single day. And so what the housing movement needs to do is to unite, to get on the streets. And that's happening in a big way for the first time in close to a decade on Saturday.
So take us through, obviously, you mentioned there are a lot of people who are backing this demonstration. Who are the biggest groups that you've got that's backing you this weekend?
So obviously, us, the London Renters Union, are the most exciting group, but there are also, over 80 different organisations backing. And so that includes some of the biggest trade unions in the country, like Unison and the National Education Union. And it also includes lots of disability justice charities, like I mentioned, but also people campaigning for justice people campaigning for their high street to bring back life to their high street, people campaigning against gentrification, people campaigning for so many different things about that affect our ability to live in cities. And that is what is exciting, because rent controls are a really winnable demand right now, but we only win when lots of people are pushing from lots of different directions. And that's why I'd really encourage as many people to get down to Soho Square on Saturday afternoon, because it is looking like it's going to be really big.
That is always good to know that there's plenty of interest already. Obviously, you mentioned there one of the biggest demands that you have there is rent controls. Now, that's not in the coming Renters' Rights Bill, which is soon to come into force in this country, passed by the Labour government, having previously been floated by the previous Conservative government due to the issues in the private rented sector. Broadly, what has been London Renters Union's response to the Renters' Rights Bill? What's good about it, and why do you think it hasn't included rent controls?
So the Renters' Rights Bill is a big victory for tenants. And the main thing that does is abolish what's called Section 21. And so Section 21 is the aspect of private renting law introduced under the Thatcher governments, which is almost unlike anything else in Europe. And what it allowed landlords to do is evict tenants for no reason with just 2 months' notice. 2 months' notice. And so how can you even begin to build a life when you could be evicted for no reason with just 2 months' notice? What if your kids are in school? And I had a close friend who was evicted by Section 21 last year, and she almost had to take her kid out of the school and move him into another one because she couldn't afford to find another house in the area. And so the Renters' Rights Act gets rid of Section 21. And that is a huge victory for tenants and comes from the hard work of the tenants movement. But the thing, as you mentioned, that the Act does almost nothing about is affordability. And the government have just bottled it. They're in the pockets of developers, so they're not willing to address the other huge issue that affects renters. Like at the London Renters Union, lots of our members, it's totally normal if you live in London to be paying more than 50% of your income on rent. Lots of our members are paying 60, 70% of their income on rent. I was chatting to one of of our members the other day. They live in North London, and they have just received a letter last month from their landlord telling them that their rent is being doubled. Their rent is being doubled. They've lived in that house for 10 years. They've lived in it for 10 years. There's NHS workers in there. And in this country, a landlord is just allowed to double the rent without you being able to do almost anything about it. And so while it's really important that the Thatcherite model of private renting, which has been embraced by New Labour, is starting to be dismantled with the Renters' Rights Act, the government needs to go further and start tackling affordability. It should be illegal to double someone's rent. We all need to be able to live in the homes, in homes. And how can we possibly do that if our landlords can jack our rents up by 100% overnight?
It is obviously a big problem in this country in terms of the stability that you mentioned. If you can be evicted at any point, that means that it's difficult to build a life. It's difficult to be able to be settled. It's difficult to be able to make the kinds of investment necessary to have a well-functioning economy, especially when all the money is being ploughed into unproductive assets like a landlord extracting rents rather than productive investments. Now, in terms of other good investments that the government could be making, but they failed on. Another one of your demands I've seen is an increase in council housing. And in the run-up to the general election, Angela Rayner talked about the fact that they were going to have the biggest increase in affordable housing, and she specifically said that it would include council housing. That hasn't happened, at least not to a very large extent. Why do you think the Labour government, again, previously the party that had always championed council housing, hasn't been as successful in building council housing as maybe they were trailing in the run-up to the election?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the promises that they made around housing before the election were both to build more council housing that we've built in a long time, and also just more homes in general in a long time. And I think there was some hope that the model might start to change, the model of relying on private developers to deliver homes in this country. But what we've seen as that government has evolved is that maybe more than any other government in recent history, they are in the pockets of developers. So they are going to build, they do say they're going to build 1.5 million homes by the end of the parliament, but they're almost entirely going to rely on private developers to do that and not actually build council housing. And even the developers themselves say this is not going to work. You know, the government says we want developers to build more housing, and then developers, like they just announced a couple of weeks ago, announced that actually they're going to build less housing this year than they did the year before, because the government doesn't have any power over developers. And why would it be in developers' interest to build so many homes that the price of houses goes down? There's one way to use development to increase affordability. And that is, as you said, but the government building homes themselves, council housing, social housing. But they are not willing to go there. They're too deep in the pockets of developers. They're too committed to this model of relying on the private market, both for home ownership and for the rental sector. And that's the housing crisis. That's the reason we've got a housing crisis. And this government just not brave enough to do the things that they need to do. And we're seeing the consequences now.
Yeah, I totally agree. So if it was up to you in terms of council housing, what kind of policy would you want to see in terms of trying to increase that number being built?
There's loads of ways to increase council housing. And when we had the period of time in this country in the second half of the 20th century where there were still people with housing problems, but in lots of ways, one of the main problems facing working class people was not a housing crisis. It's because most homes in the country were built by the government. And then what happened from 1980s onwards, every single year, more council houses were demolished or sold off than were built. And so, I spend a lot of time in Elephant and Castle, and there was a lot of social housing estates in Elephant and Castle. And then over the years, the last decade or so, they knocked thousands of them down. And now if you go to Elephant and Castle, for people who don't know, it's in South London, you'll find loads of skyscrapers. And so they've replaced all the homes. There's more homes than there were before in Elephant and Castle. But what's happened to the rents? They've almost doubled. They've skyrocketed over that period. Council houses work, and the government knows how to build them. There is There is lots of things that the government could do, for example, around land. When you sell land in this country, even if it's a farmer's field, you're allowed to sell it for the price that it would be worth if it had planning permission for housing. So you can make absolutely massive profits by acquiring rural land and selling it as if it's for housing, even if it doesn't have planning permission. Why can't the government just buy fields as fields and then build council homes on them? There are a lot of people making a lot of money out of this system, whether they're banks, whether they're landlords, whether they're land assemblers, whether they're developers. There is a lot of people with a vested interest in keeping this system this way, but most people in this country are suffering as a result. We need council housing, we need rent controls.
Excellent. I totally agree. And just to finish off, can you just remind everybody at home whereabouts they need to go and when?
Yeah, so the housing movement is uniting on Saturday and coming together for what will be the biggest demonstration of the movement in at least a decade. We are meeting at 1 p.m. at Soho Square Gardens. Come down for fun, come down to meet comrades, come down to see all the different blocks who are assembling. There's lots of great stuff planned. I can't go into any detail, but 80 organisations, including my own, the London Renters Union, are backing this. It's going to be massive because the thing is, we can win rent controls. This government is, I can't think of any other way to say it other than like completely fucked. They've completely screwed it up, and they need a policy. They need policies which stop people going to places like Reform. We've got the Green Party who are rising in the polls, and they're calling for rent controls. Plaid Cymru in Wales are calling for rent controls. Rent controls are a winnable policy. And when you have rent controls, not only do working class people and ordinary people have more money in their pocket, but they have more security in their home, which gives them the power and the confidence to get out and build the power that we need to build to take on the far right, to have a progressive alternative, to build power in our workplaces. There are so many reasons why we need to win more rent controls, and more social housing. And that's why you should come to Soho Square Gardens on Saturday at 1 p.m.
That was Joe Beswick from the London Renters Union speaking to me earlier today. Now, if you want to find out more, you can go to thehousingdemo.org. Outside of the devastation in Iran and Lebanon caused by the illegal US-Israeli war on Iran, the biggest story so far has been the petrochemical crisis caused by Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. This has pushed the price of a barrel of oil over $100, and this will obviously have a knock-on inflationary effect throughout the entire economy as energy prices underpin almost all of production. At the IMF Spring Summit, it was predicted that further rises in oil prices could lead to global recession, something that's happened only 3 times in the last 40 years, save for the coronavirus pandemic. Although at the very least, central banks are learning from their lessons from the last oil crisis that we had. In the wake of higher than expected growth figures across services, industries, and construction, Governor of the Bank of England Andrew Bailey seemed pretty dovish over potential interest rate rises in response to the crisis. This is at least some good news for the Labour government. God knows they need it. They were already unpopular due to unforced errors and facing another wave of the cost of living crisis just coming around the corner. They could at least be spared the hawkish approach to rates that ultimately led to the demise of the Conservative Party in 2024. But the coming double-dip cost of living crisis won't just be confined to the increased cost of petrochemicals. The government has recently held secret meetings for what's known as Exercise Turnstone, an emergency contingency plan in case British industry is impacted by carbon dioxide shortages due to the closure of the strait, a critical commodity for the food industry. The meetings wargamed potential worst-case scenarios, such as the strait being blocked until the summer, a situation that could potentially, if situations arise, lead to an 82% point drop in CO2 supply at most. CO2 is used in both the slaughter and packaging of certain meats and to carbonate drinks, meaning that while shortages would not necessarily lead to critical food shortages, they could lead to a lack of variety in shops and certain businesses being unable to operate, such as farming and hospitality. Now, Business Secretary Peter Kyle was asked about these plans by Sky News' Sophie Ridge this morning.
On carbon dioxide specifically, because we talked about farming, we talked breweries as well, and I'm right in saying, I think as well, because they kind of add the fizz to drinks, beer, maybe for the World Cup, perhaps a concern for people. How long kind of stockpiles do we have of this stuff?
At this moment, this is not a concern for our economy.
Okay.
I can reassure people of that.
You'll be able to get a beer for the World Cup.
If that changes, we will be. I will speak about it and I will make an announcement about it. But for this moment in time, there is not the concern because I have taken the action.
Okay, thank you. And look, it is, like you say, you never want to be alarmist with the stuff, but it's also important to kind of get the information out to people
If any of these things change, I will be upfront with the public about it in advance so that we can prepare. But right now, people should go on as they are, enjoying beer, enjoying their meats, enjoying all the salads. But also, there are critical uses for CO2. MRI scanning, for example, water purification. It's involved in our nuclear industry, our civil nuclear power industry. So some defensive uses for it as well. There's lots of needs for CO2. So these are the reasons why I took it so seriously way back just 6 months ago, not just in the last few weeks.
Now, it is quite a breath of fresh air because God knows I have plenty of bad words to say about Peter Kyle, and I have said many of them. But when you compare that kind of reaction in terms of a basic laying out of the facts from a government minister, and the fact that there has been preparation months and weeks in advance to ensure that we have all of the situations that could possibly happen already done, compared to Boris Johnson skipping all of the Cobra meetings. Was it 5 that he'd skipped during all of what happened during the pandemic? It really is night and day compared to the absolute shambles of what the Conservative Party are like, wasn't it? Now, any visible shortages of certain products could nevertheless lead to public discontent, which the plans say could compromise government messaging around the security broadly of food supply, although world fertilizer shortages could also hit food inflation due to the Hormuz blockade. Another shortage that would be very publicly visible is jet fuel. The International Energy Authority has warned of flight cancellations around the corner due to jet fuel shortages and due to Europe's lack of stockpiles. Deliveries that set off pre-blockade, they're still arriving, but this is due to dry up very soon, meaning cancellations could be coming as early as 6 weeks, just as families prepare to go away on holiday during the summer. Families in the UK have already borne the brunt of pressures on luxuries as costs rise. Having their summer holidays impacted by flight cancellations could spell doom for the government, although at the very least there shouldn't be any cancellations before the May elections as far as Starmer is concerned. Now, Dalia, this is obviously showing just the amount of power that disruptions to global trade has to influence broader economic problems, not just in terms of very specific commodities that have knock-on effects to the energy sector, but anything that underpins other industries globally could also have knock-on effects affecting access to food, access to certain businesses that could lead to further problems, and as was mentioned by the IMF, potential global recessions, right? So what does this tell us about the future state of globalization and of free trade?
I mean, I think it's really, the last 5 years has been a real wake-up call for a lot of people living in Europe and in North America that you can't wreak havoc, or at least you can no longer wreak havoc throughout the world and be completely insulated from the effects of that. I think there is something quite distasteful about in that Sky clip of, people in Lebanon right now are burying their relatives in temporary graves, and Sky News is like, will we still be able to get a beer in the World Cup? And I'm just like, how? Anyway, these people live in a different world to me, perhaps. But look, when it comes to sort of the future of globalization, I think it's going to be interesting to see how different governments, particularly in the West, sort of respond to the fact that it is becoming very clear that there are weaknesses and vulnerabilities in these global supply chains that mean that we are feeling the impacts of disruption throughout the world in a way that perhaps we didn't beforehand. And of course, this is also all happening in a context of climate breakdown, which is its own kind of shock and is going to cause its own kinds of disruptions to the supply chain of various essential resources, from food to energy to fertilizer to everything else. And if we look specifically at the way that Starmer is responding, I think there's been some interesting developments. But, throughout sort of this idea that we sort of had, let me start actually with Starmer's response. So Starmer wrote an article, quite an interesting editorial actually, and the man rarely does anything interesting, so it really did catch my eye. He wrote an interesting editorial in The Guardian last week, I believe, where he basically talked about the idea that we are no longer living in a world of relative stability, that the world is now entering an era of repeated, substantial crises and shocks. And Britain needs to be prepared for that kind of world. Now, he's sort of hinting to what Adam Tooze calls a polycrisis. And I think it's important that he recognizes that. I think he was very much elected on this myth of this return to normal, or this kind of return to bureaucratic kind of tinkering around the edges.
Stability was the change. Stability was the line that they went with in the election.
Stability was the change, and now it's clear that actually change is the stability. Change is the sort of the defining feature of this era. That's really important. And he says, we need to develop like an industrial strategy and an energy strategy that prepares Britain for this new era that we're entering in. And sure, we need to decarbonize our energy system. We need to localize our food system. We need to think about the ways in which we can exist in a world where shocks and crises are the norm. When you look at the past sort of 5 years, I would say that this era kind of started from 2008, but even if you just look at the past 5 years, you have the pandemic, you have Gaza, you have Ukraine, you have the cost of living crisis, you have various climate crises throughout the world, and now you have Iran. Maybe we could have dealt with one of those things quite effectively, but that number of deep crises happening in such a short space of time is something that we are not able to deal with. But the problem remains with Starmer is that he cannot help but be Starmer, which is first of all, what's missing there is a lack of understanding of the responsibility that Britain holds and has historically held in creating the unstable world that we live in. And so part of that is, for example, no longer bankrolling and legitimizing and offering resources and support to one of the key agents of chaos in the region, that in the Middle East, that is causing a lot of these shocks, which is Israel. Until you address, it's not like you can just retreat into Britain's borders and create this self-contained Britain that can be resilient to external shocks. You also have to address the role that Britain is playing in generating those shocks. And second of all, there is no acknowledgement yet from Starmer that in order to actually protect people in this country from these shocks, you are going to have to enter into a new social contract. Gone are the neoliberal days of we just let corporations get bigger and bigger and get fat off different crises and fat off shock therapy and disaster capitalism. Gone are the days where energy companies can profiteer off energy crises. We have got to enter into an era where the state is willing to intervene on behalf of its citizens, to distribute wealth fairly, to stop profiteering from crises, whether it's windfall taxes on oil companies or stopping supermarkets from exploiting the cost of living crisis to raise their prices. And so we're going to have to radically rethink what the role of the state is going forward. And we are not seeing any evidence that the Starmer government is willing to do that. We saw recently the IMF basically issuing a diktat to Rachel Reeves saying, don't you dare think about offering blanket support to households and small businesses to protect them from the energy crisis that is emerging from the war in Iran. And she basically said, yes, sure, no, we're not going to offer wholesale blanket support for households to protect them against rising energy prices, because she fundamentally does not think that it is the role of the state to do that. So even though we're seeing kind of rhetorically an acknowledgement of Starmer that his stability is, that change is stability, or stability is change, or whatever, is no longer viable in the world that we live in, we still are not seeing the political will to actually, in light of that changing global context, rewrite the social and economic contract and political contract that this country has been running on for the past 30 years that cannot protect people effectively from the kind of world that we're entering.
I remember you saying in your contribution there, the people's obviously to blame, obviously, were creating this crisis in Israel. There's been no kind of acknowledgement of that given what's happened. And there's obviously protests happening in Ireland at the moment around fuel. I think they're happening in Norway as well about the price of diesel. And they're both protesting the government. And there is farmers in the UK threatening to protest the government as well over the price of fuel here. And I'm like, should we be protesting at the Israeli embassy by any chance? Given that these are the people who caused this massive wars, right? Just saying. There's a fascinating article in the latest edition of the New Statesman, and it delves into what appears to be an increasingly entrenched battle of the sexes. But unlike endless coverage of the manosphere and the trouble with men, this is maybe the first investigation I've seen looking into what's going on with young women. One thing it captures well is the real divide in outlooks between young men and young women, with its author, Emily Lawford, writing this. Exclusive polling by Merlin Strategy for the New Statesman reveals that young women, aged between 18 and 30, are by far the most progressive demographic in the UK. This polling found that young women are 26 percentage points less likely to feel positively about capitalism than young men, and much less likely to feel the economy works in their favour. They are also much more pessimistic about their future, their own future and everyone else's. They also feel much more negatively towards young men than young men feel toward them. Later in the article, there's one bit more on the polling. Strikingly, the polling done for the New Statesman suggests more privileged women are the most pessimistic of all. Women in middle-class professions are less likely to say they feel valued by society, and are less likely to believe that if they work hard, they will succeed in life when compared with their working-class counterparts. Young men are now more likely to be unemployed than young women, yet young women are far more financially cynical. They are 21 points less likely than young men to believe that they will ever out-earn their parents. White women are more likely to feel the country is racist than non-white women. At one point, Lawford visits the Feminist Society at the University of Leeds, where she asks the group's members for their views on the young men they knew, and here's what they said. I don't care for them, said a girl called Ruby imperiously. She had red hair and lots of silver jewellery. They're not bad people, but they refuse to call out their friends who make other girls uncomfortable. They'll laugh at jokes that are sexist, racist, or homophobic. They don't care about political issues. I don't think they like women a lot. If a man is attracted to you, she said, he might talk about things like toxic misogyny. If he doesn't fancy you, he won't bother. I feel like a lot of it is quite sexually motivated with men. I asked if they'd considered dating a man with different politics. They all immediately said no. I don't think I'd even be friends with one, said one girl. They don't see you as human. Only one woman, Evelyn, admitted to having male friends, though she was worried this made her a quote-unquote pick-me, trying too hard for male attention. Evelyn was concerned about what the men she knew were watching online. The stuff that's being said about women is crazy, she said. They're getting all these reels talking about bad stuff about women. And I get reels of women saying bad stuff about men. I try to think not all men are like this, but... The polling in the article was conducted by a company called Merlin Strategies. Its founder, Scarlett Maguire, went into some of her findings when it came to how men and women saw each other on the New Statesman's podcast.
We're very used to hearing about young men's negative views of young women, but this really struck me because we found that, 72% of young men have a favourable view of young women, 7%, and not very many really, have an unfavourable view of young women. When it comes to women under 30, though, only 50% have a favourable view. The unfavourable view of men goes up to 21%, and then under 25 women, it's just 35% of young women who have a favourable view of men. And if you go into very favourable, it's just 11% of under 25 women. So we are looking at an environment where young women feel a lot more negatively towards young men than the other way around.
That gap in perception has had a knock-on effect on what men and women want from the future. The article goes on to say this. Ruby had recently carried out a survey for a course. She asked 30 final year students, 15 men and 15 women, where they see themselves when they're 30. Of the men, all but 2 said they wanted to be married with children. Only 3 women said the same. Even the women in relationships didn't want to get married. None in the Leeds group found this surprising. Most of their friends felt that way. It's a much bigger deal for us to become mothers. We have to get rid of our career, Evelyn explained. I'm not fully against kids. I just don't really want to lose the other things and become just a mother. I want to still be me. I will probably lose that. These women weren't outliers. According to the New Statesman's polling, young women are twice as likely not to want children as young men. All the Leeds women told me that they feared a reform government pressuring them to have babies. One woman mentioned Suella Braverman's pledge to scrap the Equality Act and repeal other human rights laws. It just feels out of control. Dalia, lots of information to go through there. I'm sure you have plenty of opinions about this one specifically. And it's certainly true, I think, that there is a misogyny problem amongst young men at the moment. But there is a lot of an us versus them narrative going on here. I want to know what your thoughts are about everything that we've heard there.
Yeah, so I mean, there were some things that really surprised me. One of them was that they found that white women were more likely to think that the UK was racist than non-white women. That basically bucks the trend of any other comparable study on this topic. And I'd be interested to know, is that an outlier? Is that kind of a quirk of this study, or does that signal something like deeper? Is there a deeper, real shift happening there? The other thing that I wasn't as surprised about, but I thought was really interesting, was the fact that women under 30, and I think it's very important to remember that this conversation is happening with women under 30, because I think it changed some of the findings would change if you went towards or talked about women who are older, and for many reasons, and I can come onto that later. But it was somewhat surprising to me that women under 30 seem to be doing relatively better in the economy in terms of they're less likely to be unemployed, but they have less favorable views of the economic system. That kind of is somewhat not intuitive. You would think if you're doing better in an economy, you would be more favorable of the economic system. But what we're seeing here is that women are, yes, doing relatively better compared to men in their age group, but that doesn't mean that they think of capitalism favorably and all of this, which is, quite an interesting thing. I was a lot less surprised by the idea that heterosexuality is in crisis, and, more and more young women in particular are not wanting to get married, are deprioritizing relationships with men in their lives. I think what we are seeing is that women are on strike until conditions improve. And there's so many different reasons, I think, for why not only the situation as women perceive it has declined so much, but also that women are responding differently to what they might see as some of the shortfalls of men and getting into relationships with men. The political is one. What's identified in this study, what's kind of emphasized a lot in this study is, look, men and women seem to occupy different worlds. Young men and women are occupying very different political and ideological frameworks. And that gap, that chasm is becoming so wide that it's kind of difficult to date across it. That's true. I work with a lot of young people, and it does kind of feel like they are living in different ideological frameworks from one another. But I also think there's a really key economic element here, which is this dual process of increased economic independence of women and increased economic impotence of men. So what do I mean by that? In terms of economic independence, obviously, compared to, generations before us, women are more likely than their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers to be able to provide for themselves economically without the support of a partner. I mean, it was not that long ago, it was still in living memory, that a woman would not be able to get a bank account, to get a loan without sign-off from her husband. So when you remove that economic dependence, you get into this situation where a lot of women are like, look, I don't need a man for money. I can provide that for myself. I don't need a man just for company. I have my friends for that. And also, I think we're seeing a cultural shift. Single women have historically been very stigmatized. I think due to a lot of very hard work from women, that has changed. This idea that being a single woman is tantamount to like social death has changed. And that's a very, very good thing. And so women are like, look, the one thing I actually need from you is emotional availability, emotional intimacy, and emotional connection. And that is the one thing that men have just not been socialized on how to provide. It's the one thing that men are not taught how to do. I don't think when you look at the way that young boys are raised, that they are taught to really prioritize connection and prioritize the work of connection, whether it's with their partners, with their friends, or even with themselves. And so a lot of women are like, well, if you're not going to provide for me the thing that I actually want from you, then I'm just going to build a life that doesn't require having a male partner in it. And then I think the kind of what I call the sort of economic impotence of men is, the gendered ideal of men that they have been taught to aspire to, which is, male breadwinner, the ability to provide, financially for you and for a family. that is no longer economically viable anymore. You know, the economy is completely broken. And so when you have a group of people for whom, you know, they are constantly being told this is what you should be, this is what you must be socially and culturally, but the material world that they live in makes that impossible, that breeds resentment, it breeds anger, and it breeds depression. And that's a very difficult combination to date. You know, you don't want to date someone who's resentful and angry all the time because, you know, what they have been told they need to aspire to is something that they repeatedly are unable to get to for many reasons, many of which are structural. And so, yeah.
From Larry Stevenson,
Yeah.
where he's speaking with Daniel Priestley, you know, talking about the idea that these all these influences, especially financial influence, but also the manosphere influences too, a lot of men engage with, they're saying like, if you fail, it's because you didn't try hard enough,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So essentially put the onus upon them to be this archetypal breadwinner figure, which, as you say, economically incredibly difficult for them to aspire to. And Gareth's like, you're giving people mental illness by doing so. It's really, really toxic. And I think it plays into what you said before about these ideological frameworks. And there's an increasing shift, I think, in men going towards an individualistic framework, which is why it's all about, you know, going towards the economics of individualism and chasing being the entrepreneur or whatever it is, or cryptocurrency, these kind of things that have, obviously I'm not saying this is universal, right? But these are more kind of popular amongst men than women. And whereas women are going towards far more collectivist beliefs. So we saw in the same data there from Merlin Strategies, women having a more favorable view of communism than capitalism, right? That's a real divergence, I think. One thing I have an issue with is that if we were in this position where one half of this gender divide has an increasingly negative view of the other, Ash writes in her book, Minority Rule, about how leftist movements of the last 15 years or so haven't focused enough on solidarity and that we've become a little bit tribalistic in focusing on individual demographics rather than trying to find things that unite those demographics together. So if we don't tackle this antipathy towards the genders that we're seeing at the moment, it's going to be difficult to find the common bonds that we can share to then try and bring people over on the things we disagree about. So, for example, right, all of these different things that men and women, young men and women, seem to not understand about each other are going to be difficult to mend if we can't find ways in which of uniting, in my opinion, around class issues. Because again, like everybody can agree, economy super screwed up for young people. Men and women, super screwed up. They should have different prescriptions on how to solve that issue, whether it's through state policy or through collective action, which women seem to more prefer, or whether it's through rugged individualism, every man for himself. You must try as hard as possible to be able to break out the system on your own without collective action. That seems to be the men are more likely to go towards, especially kind of Zoomer men. And to try and find a synthesis of that brings everybody together so that we can then fight what is, again, like, the issues around gendered politics in this country. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think that the key message there is that this rugged capitalistic individualism is not going to liberate you. What is going to liberate you is actually, I mean, there's so much Fox News discourse about like the wussification of men, but I think that there is part of like, I think a lot of men would really benefit in their younger years from learning how to be a little bit more like girls in the sense of how to prioritize connection and how to see yourself as interdependent with and responsible for and accountable to and cared for and caring towards other people. Because I think that kind of what we've done is we have pushed men into this, like, and what these kind of like a lot of these influences and this manosphere thing has done is it has taken this antipathy and brokenness and alienation that I think people across the genders of all genders are experiencing and pushing it into a like dog eat dog, you know, competition, domination kind of attitude. You know, the Jordan Peterson would probably have a similar diagnosis to me in terms of the economics of why we're in the situation that we're in. But his argument is, okay, well, the way that we deal with that is we just take away women's economic independence and we make them reliant financially on men again so that they have to marry and they have to be in relationships with men in order to be able to survive. When obviously, if you actually looked at it from a different perspective and you said, look, what if men and women could come together and fight against an economy that requires people to have to exert these kind of power balances between one another, where, you know, one group holds all the power financially and the other is reliant on them? Because, by the way, like, a loving and good relationship can never exist in a context of economic reliance, as far as I'm concerned, or economic dependence. And so actually being able to offer a vision that is liberating for both men and women is absolutely critical. But I think it's very difficult because I think a lot of the time that kind of ideal of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, getting ahead by dominating and exploiting others, remains the ideal of masculinity that we have in the West. And until men are able to decouple themselves and disinvest from that in themselves, it's going to be really difficult to be able to kind of bridge that divide, because I don't think that that's work that women can do for them, if that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, I can certainly understand that point. It's got to be something that men themselves get into. Like James Bloodworth does really good work, I think, in talking about men's mental health and stuff like that, and talking about the lack of men going to therapy. A good article he did today on that kind of stuff. But one thing I do want to go back to, in the article, obviously they went to a feminist society specifically, and I think they kind of got boilerplate feminist opinions that they would have got if they'd gone to any feminist society for the past 4 decades or whatever. So it did seem like Merlin's strategies weren't exactly pulling necessarily archetypal views of what women think, whereas there's a lot of, I think, as you say, some pushback to the kind of attitudes that a lot of younger men do have. But we were talking before the show, actually, that when it comes to, I think, a really kind of healthy gendered politics in this country, I think millennials have got it. I think millennials have got it. You know, I think that we've generally, broadly, amongst our demographic, been more likely to break down gendered expectations and the expectations, not just in terms of like the sharing of household responsibilities, in terms of approaches to the economy, approaches to gendered expectations on top of that, but also when it comes to like dating and things like that, though it's become far more equal in terms of who's expected to do what, in terms of how relationships are formed, who approaches who. And I think that's a really kind of healthy dynamic that millennials have. But Zoomers, significantly more conservative in the way that I've seen them approach these things. And gendered expectations, especially gender, I think there's a lot of gender expectations that have been put on men from all sides, whether it be from women they're trying to date or from men who are trying to influence them, that have broken down a lot of what was built by millennials. I don't know what you think about them.
I think that what you're seeing is a much more significant polarization and divide between how different genders approach these questions, that for Gen Z is making connection and understanding across these divides very, very difficult. I think with millennials, and I think it also varies between like older millennials and like younger millennials, but we didn't have as much of a like polarizing dynamic, but also I think we weren't as wrapped up in kind of like internet cultures, which I think a lot of these sort of like gender wars stuff kind of emerges from. But I do still fundamentally think that the fact that the fact that a lot of women are saying basically, it is not life or death for me to be in a relationship. Like, I will be in a relationship if that relationship offers something to me that I want and meets certain expectations. I think that is also something that millennial women have, and that is separate to and kind of exists outside of like polarized or like extremist online discourse. I think that's rooted in a very real thing. But I think that maybe there wasn't as much of a space for, I think, millennial men compared to Gen Z men. You know, I think a lot of my single millennial women friends would be like, millennial men also suck. But like, I think that compared to Gen Z men, I think millennial men felt a little bit like, okay, I've got to kind of get on board with some of this. So I'm going to try and sort of like figure out, there sort of was more of a negotiation and a settlement. Whereas now things have become so polarized. And I don't think that we can draw a comparison between women saying, you know, I don't think I want to get married, or I don't want to be in a relationship, or I have built a vision of my life that does not include a man. I don't think that's the same as the way that the manosphere talk about women. Because I think for women, it's the thing of like, look, the conditions of heterosexuality are fucked and I'm going to build my life so that I don't have to participate in that. Whereas the manosphere is based around dominating and breaking women down. I mean, we saw it in that kind of Louis Theroux Manosphere documentary. We've seen it when, clips have come up in our news feed. So I think that they're kind of very different, and therefore, like, one is, I think, a response to quite legitimate conditions, even if sometimes it's articulated in these kind of boilerplate, I don't want to be, like, I think the phrasing that I found a bit kind of corny was like, one woman admitted to having male friends but was worried that it would make her pick me. Like, I don't think that that's a general view amongst young women. I think that is something that, was kind of very specifically picked out from like a university feminist society group. But I think that the idea that women are saying, look, I'm going to cultivate a life that does not require me to make huge concessions about how I want to be treated and what I value in my life, just because you're telling me that being single is no better than social death, I think that's a really good thing. And I say that as a woman who is like getting married in July to a man, nonetheless, God forbid. But for me, the fact that single women, like the conditions for single women and partnered women are really intimately connected. Because if we allow single women to be stigmatized, to be shamed, to be economically punished in the way that they have historically been, then the conditions for partnered women is also going to go downhill, because now I can be in a relationship where my partner doesn't have to meet even the bare minimum, because he can say, well, you have to put up with me or you're going to be out there single, which is like the worst thing in the world. And then in relation to that, if the conditions for partnered women, if women are accepting really shit behavior in their relationships with men, then women who are single who might be dating men are going to basically be met with this idea that, well, my married male friends or my partnered male friends give their partners the bare minimum, so I, in dating you, can give you the bare minimum. So our conditions are really related. And so for me, I think being nihilistic about it is very much against my politics, because being nihilistic about the ability of people to change and the ability of people to find solidarity, that is so tantamount to my politics and is so oppositional to my politics. But I do think that the idea that women will be like, I am going to cultivate a full, connected, enriched life that doesn't involve having to participate in a relationship that will break me down, I think that is overall a really good thing. And I think that men stand to learn something from that, which is that in the wake of the heterosexuality crisis, building your ability to connect with yourself and the world around you, rather than retreating into this individualism, is actually more conducive to like your own happiness and liberation, as well as the happiness and liberation of people around you.
Okay, one thing I would like to finish off on here is that I think the level to which that there is antipathy here, of course, we talked a lot in this segment. It was obviously an article a lot about women's opinions here, but we've kind of talked about it within the context of like women's reaction towards the behavior of men. But in one of the quotes that we got there in the article, this person did specifically mention, obviously, the online discourse does have a lot of content with men being disparaging of women, but also said the same in reverse too, that women are getting a lot of content about like, men deserve to be lonely, the loneliness crisis is self-inflicted. And do you think that there is not a level to which this goes both ways?
I don't think so.
Okay. I mean,
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. Because I think the idea that the loneliness crisis is self-inflicted. I mean, look, that compassion understanding has to underpin this entire conversation. Like it is, and to say like the male loneliness crisis is, deserved is obviously like lacking in compassion, and it is lacking in kind of like political strategy, because, that's not where you don't get somewhere by just kind of by simply kind of laughing off a kind of crisis that that a group of people are experiencing. But I think it is kind of like, well, look, because the term incel, involuntary celibate, I know we're going like so over time right now, so I'm going to try and like be really quick. But the term involuntary celibate was actually developed by a woman of color theorist who was talking about how the kind of sexual rejection of women who do not fit the aesthetic or beauty norm has created this thing called involuntary celibacy. And the response to that was for women to create communities with one another to fill that emotional and social gap. Whereas it's interesting that the political response to that for men has been kind of the opposite, which has been to kind of turn inward and to create these kinds of deeply hierarchical ways of thinking. And I think that saying like, look, when you say the male loneliness crisis is self-inflicted, it comes in a harsh package, but the other way of saying this is that like, it doesn't have to be like this. You don't have to say that the only reason that I can stop a woman from leaving me is by having a society that coerces her to be there with me. Like, have more, like, building self-esteem and building connection is the only antidote, and building solidarity is the only antidote to this kind of hate. But I don't think that they can be equivocated in that way.
Okay, yeah, I can understand that perspective for sure. No worries. Well, thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
It's been an absolute pleasure. We definitely go into the weeds with that last story. As always, thank you everyone for tuning in at home. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.